then puddle it down so it's very, very light. Just give a slight wash so that it's not completely white paper. And going down to the skyline where it joins the sea, around the rock. Just makes it look a little bit warmer. Now while that's drying, I can't touch the sea, but I could do a lovely rock in the foreground, which has got lots of seaweed on. These rocks on the North Cornish coast are very layered. So I'm using Paynes Grey and yellow ochre together. And I'm going to use a little bit of indigo. Puddle it all down and make a very, very gentle start. Now the reason I drew it in pencil was that to show the layers. So it's hasn't got a round edge like a pebble. You can see all the different sections. Now I'll drop some yellow in a minute and that will send them in a different way. Even on top there's a few sort of like thin slices. Now I'll just drop some Naples yellow, and if you haven't got Naples yellow, use very diluted yellow ochre. This beach is Trebarwith Strand, which is just south of Tintagel. Find its own way with a chemical reaction. Send one pigment against the other, and it's starting to look like a very rugged rock. Now the next rock is very dark because it's in shadow, so I'll put the dark side in. And that sets the atmosphere for the beach. You don't have to put people in beach scenes, but these people are very small and they're further away, so it's not personal, and it adds some colour and shape and form to the picture. But people are moving all the time. I often find that I've painted the bottom of one person and the top of the next person who passes. You can't get people on holiday to stand still for you. So that's made a start there. You can see the atmospheres developing. So the next stage is to do the rock. This is known as gull rock, and it's green on top and a little bit of yellow ochre. I'm just going to again rub the pencil line back. What I'm going to do is let the water and the paint do the work. The rocks are quite brown in places, so because this one's above the water, so it's a lighter colour than these that are submerged a lot. It gets a chance to dry out. So I'm going to go around with a mixture of raw umber and Paynes Grey. Just go gently around the rock. It's a bit dark around the bottom. Dry the brush completely. Go back to the green. Because it's got some yellow in it, it will find its own route. And then when that's dry, I'll add a little bit more definition to it. Just a little bit of yellow there. Helps send the paint away. Always best to do some of these rocks in two phases. So now that the front one has dried, I can add some seaweed, which I'm using sap green and lemon yellow, a bit of chrome yellow. Amazing how green seaweed is. A little bit of French ultramarine. And then it's sort of dried on there, but it's long and strandy, so I'm going to take most of the paint off the brush and just go the way I did with the rocks. Just gently lay it on. And it's fallen down the side here onto the beach. I discovered this beach many years ago. The school teacher I knew painted there. But there's so many little coves in North Cornwall that sometimes you can't find them all. It's good to have a hint of where they are. I'm now changing to a smaller brush, and I'm going to change the colour of the paint slightly by adding a little bit more yellow. Just going in the same direction again. Obviously some seaweeds a bit like dried grass, and others are very fibrous and almost like a succulent plant. A little bit more blue, keep changing the tones. It's much darker around the edge. Just keep going as much as you want to. The amount of detail you put in is a personal matter. The sand here is several colours. We've got grey because there's a lot of slate that's washed down, and sort of a biscuity colour. So I'm going to go for the biscuity colour first and just pop it in, and where it's darker, it's a much darker shade, so I can go all the way and put the darker colour on top. And the water is falling back from the beach, so I'm doing the sand in the direction of the sea, not sideways, so that you can see that it's being pulled back by the water. All the water's being sucked out of it. And then this grey area, which is obviously a little bit of where the slate's washed down. So I'm making that a little bit more blue, and that has got lines in it where the waves have compressed it. So I'll just put the lines in. But I don't want it to look like the seaweed, so I'm just going to go gently sideways. A bit more water. And then it goes back to being biscuity coloured again. Sort of patches of sand and patches of muddy slate. And again, the water going down has just changed the direction of the way the sand is shaped. It's leaving little ridges. And it goes back to being more slatey. Just keep going and looking and finding all the detail. And then where it's very wet, it's a much darker colour, so I'll use some raw sienna and put that in. And for the shadow that I had earlier. And it's reflecting the person there carrying a child. Now that the sky is dried, I'm going to increase the colour on the top right hand corner only, up to the cloud. Same colours, but just gives it a little bit more punch. And I'll let the edges off with water because it goes to infinity due to the shape of the pad I'm using. If I paint on the beach, I always have a smaller piece of paper. You're climbing over rocks and things to get there. You do not want anything large. So beach pictures always tend to be a bit smaller. There's a couple of beach pictures I did in the past, and it's very thick. It's almost like cardboard, and you can just put them in your pocket or your bag and just wander off with them. They won't come to much harm. So this is again quite thick paper, and it works well. Now I'm going to let that all dry before I put the rock in anymore, but I can start with these rocks here because I didn't touch the cloud. So again, I'm using a mixture of dark grey and brown. Mixing it all together. Dry the brush off. And then just go in very, very gently. You want to find a solid edge, and then you can add layers to it. Just show the nooks and crannies of this type of rock. Then moving further down, the rocks will be darker at the bottom because they would have had the water on them more recently. Get a brush and just pull the paint back so there's not a hard line. And it reveals the lovely little area of sea. And you get some rocks on top of others, so there will be some very dark areas to put in shortly. When you're on the beach, it's not always finding the best composition, it's finding somewhere where there isn't somebody standing in front of you. But this works quite well looking out onto Gull Rock. That's enough to get me started, and you can see that it shows the rock nicely against the white cloud in the background. Just put a bit of shadow into the rocks in the foreground using a very dark grey with a mixture of homemade grey and Paynes Grey tinted with a little bit of blue. I'll put the recipes in the description. I'm now going over the top of the rock with very light homemade grey because it'll find its own route, and it's much lighter than the side. I'll do the same with the rock with the seaweed on as well. I can always pull some back with a flat brush. Just work it into the seaweed. Now there's another flat rock here that I've only put the dark side in, and it's partly submerged. I'll just use homemade grey on that, and then drop some yellow ochre into it because it's got sand and all sorts of things picked up with it. And then there's two more dark ones here which I can put in. And then there's nothing to behind the people, so I'll get the very dark again, go all the way to the edge and put some in behind the man's legs. It's a good idea to put people in because it gives you a scale. I'll make that a little bit darker now I've identified it. And then on top, just a little bit of homemade grey, very thin. And I can tint that a little bit more in a minute. Now the other rocks, the shadows aren't black because they're further away and there's a lot of bounce light off them. They seem to be brown. So I've got brush, number 4 brush. I'm just going to go along the waterline and then pull the paint back up. The rocks are jagged, so I'll just do upward strokes, and then I'll do some sideways strokes into it with a slightly different colour. I'll use the homemade grey. Just go sideways, just pulling them about a little bit to try and make it look uneven. And they're very eroded by the water. So just make a few marks. Sometimes less is more. I can come back to it and add highlights. And every now and again you get a very dark piece next to a very light piece, so I'll put the dark piece in seems to be like a big crack. And there's another dark area here. Once you've got a few, you can map it all off, which is why the people are quite useful, just to get the scale. Just let the paint bounce over the paper, and that gives half the indication of a rock without me actually doing anything. I'll just feather this off a little bit. Now the answer is to go over it with yellow. This is yellow ochre, and that will bounce across, and that will help separate the colours into nooks and crannies. The next stage is to put the sea in. So I'm just going to let the brush down a bit. It's quite a delicate colour, it's not anything too bold. Can always go back again, but it's subtle colours. When you're doing rocks and delicate colours, you have to keep changing the water. Make sure that it's coming out the shade you want, it's not tinted by anything else. That's fine for a first coat. Can always put a little bit of highlight on it. And it's quite white as it meets the rocks. Now here changes completely, so there's some coming round the end of the rock that's not in shadow, so I can put that in. And lots of stray areas of current and splashing from children. Then it goes very green, so we try and mix the original sea colour with the green I already had and put some in. So I'll start with next to the rocks. It's not quite dark enough. I think I need to add some more. It's quite strong in the shadows. Probably need 2 or 3 different greens to get it looking right. There's a thin line of very dark green. Just get the brush and pull the paint that you've already got forward. Go around any people that you've chosen to put in. And it stops by the rock because there's a shadow there. That's making the rock stand up more. Whilst that's drying, I'm going back to the rock that's out at sea that isn't too definite because it's so far away. So you just need a rough shape. Don't panic about it too much. Put a hard silhouette round it and then pull the paint forward. It's got quite a long tide line as well. So now clean the brush off, dab it, try and pull the paint down a little bit and up from the bottom. And there's a little bit of grass that's determined to live on top, so we've got to make room for that. And there's lots of nooks and crannies, so keep pulling the dark line back until you feel that you're happy with it. And then add some green. Brush off a little bit more yellow because it's further away. There'll be different things out there. Colours change with distance. I've mixed up Brazilian crimson and Naples yellow to do this young girl's legs and her arms. stands out as a warm colour against the colder colour sea. And there's somebody here, you can just see his face on the surfboard, or bodyboard. And then there's a young man standing. There's not really any skin showing there. Somebody here's got a little bit showing. Let's sponge it back a bit with my finger. And then moving on to the lady carrying the baby, we've got two legs which show nicely, and her shoulder and arm. And then the child's legs. And then coming over to the chap in the black t-shirt, we've got an arm and a face. Nothing technical, it's just shapes and a couple of legs. And then the little girl holding the bucket, we've got an arm, one arm completely out, and a head and her legs. And then we've got her mum behind. So it's given the suggestion of people without too much effort. So I now need to do their hair, which I don't want to be the same colour as the rocks. So I'm just going to lighten it a little bit with some warm earth colours. I'm using Venetian red and Naples yellow just for a change, to get them to stand forward of the rocks. And a little bit darker can come with a sort of a bit of a shadow. You want to change the colours so that one stands out against the other. If I did everybody's hair the same colour as the rocks, we wouldn't really see them. Go for the little girls, which is the back of her head we've got there. And her mum's hardly showing. And then these people here can do them a bit lighter. So there's no actual draftsmanship there, it's just shapes. So I'm now going to do the mum's shorts here. I've just added a second coat to some of the t-shirts because they didn't show very well. But it's just a lovely little scene of North Cornwall, people enjoying the sunny weather.